Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Mary Grabar. Her new book is Debunking the 1619 Project, Exposing the Plan to Divide America. Her previous book, which I read, which led me to her new book, is Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America. Okay. Mary Grabar was born in Slovenia when it was still part of the communist Yugoslavia, and grew up in Rochester, New York. She earned her PhD in English from the University of Georgia in 2002 and taught at a number of colleges and universities in Georgia until 2013. While teaching, she wrote widely on political, cultural, and educational topics and founded the Dissident Prof Education Project, a nonprofit reform initiative. In 2014, she moved to Clinton, New York, and became a resident fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. She taught at the college level for 20 years, most recently at Emory University, and her work has been published in Federalist, Town Hall, Front Page Magazine, City Journal, American Greatness, and Academic Questions. As you'll note, she is a conservative Christian, so actually we get into a little bit of that at the end. She indulges my riffs on some of that. But the primary focus of the conversation is on the 1619 Project. What are the claims that are being made? And why do not just she as a conservative or working at a conservative think tank is a problem, but why most liberal historians of that period of time, the American colonial era and the Revolutionary War, the Founding Fathers, the Civil War, all the way up to the present, what do they have to say about the facts that are presented, or the claims that are presented in the 1619 projects as facts when in fact they aren't, and what is actually going on there? That's the primary focus of our conversation. That is pseudo-history, which is one of my areas of study, and Holocaust denial, but there's so many other forms of it. And this is one of them. I do think the 1619 Project is a form of pseudo-history. That is history being driven by current ideological trends and beliefs. And she does that also more broadly with the Howard Zinn book, because Howard Zinn wrote basically an entire history of the United States from that perspective, and there's a lot of distortion in there, so we get into that as well. It's a shame that it even has to come up that she's a conservative and I'm not, but this historian is a liberal, and these historians are conservative versus those liberal historians, and so on. That's the world we live in. That's just the way it goes. She does recommend and discuss Jill Lepore's book, These Truths, as a counter to Howard Zinn, and I read that book. I agree. I think it's, in terms of corruption by ideology, it's about as neutral and fair as you can get. So I do recommend that, as well as Thomas Sowell's books on all these issues, because he's deeply read and wrote many books about slavery and race relations, not just in the United States, but especially in other countries. So this was an interesting conversation to try to get at the truth of this, given the political sensitivity of the world we're living in today. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I certainly did. It was most stimulating. And as always, we appreciate your support. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so at skeptic.com/donate, because the podcast is overarchingly supported by the Skeptic Society. Skeptic.com/donate, and that's a tax-deductible donation. The podcast is also supported by Wondrium, WONDRIUM, Wondrium.com/Shermer will get you a free trial. Wondrium is the former Great Courses. They have superb content online, courses, lectures, professors, experts, documentary films and series, and learning platforms of many kind. And it's a subscription-based, and it's $20 a month. And you can get a free trial and give it a try. If you don't like it, just don't renew. But you get that free month through Wondrium.com/Shermer. So give it a try. I use it all the time. Thanks for listening and enjoy the podcast. You were born in Slovenia, and then you were immigrated to the United States. This is during communist, when it was part of communist Yugoslavia. Tell us a little bit about that, how that might have influenced your worldview, and do tell us a little bit about your own personal history of how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, well, my parents brought me here when I was 2 years old, and they escaped over the border to Austria when it was still Yugoslavia. And so I don't remember that period of my life, but we did go back when I was 12 years old. So I got a taste of it, saw how my cousins lived and how my relatives lived. And, I had taken, indoor plumbing for granted, but my relatives
Oh my
didn't have
God,
that.
that's crazy.
Yeah, I appreciated toilets when I got back. But I also, growing up, heard all these stories about running away, escaping after World War II, being in the refugee camp. My parents with me were for 9 months. My uncles were for longer periods of time. The repression, the way the communists demanded food, and even such things as having enough food was never something that one could take for granted. Because the commissars would come around. So I heard these stories, and you were allotted, depending on the size of your family, only one hog, right? And if you felt that that wouldn't tide your family over, you were not allowed to have it. So you had people in the middle of the night doing slaughtering in the middle of the night so that they wouldn't be reported. And so you had to come up with these ways to survive. And freedom of speech was not something that one could take for granted there. I remember my father asking my uncles, what was the political situation like, and they were afraid to even speak up in their own homes. So it's a very, very different sort of mindset to live under a communist regime. So I've always been fascinated with people who adhere to communism or promote communism. In my colleagues in graduate school and when I was teaching, I thought, you people just don't know. You have no idea of what it's really like. So that sort of forms my worldview and has led me into some places of research that most other people don't go.
Yes, and stories like that are plentiful for people that have lived in these communist countries or far left socialist countries, and they're all the same. They always fail. So why is it that anybody ever bothers at this point to go, it just wasn't done right, or we just need to rejigger the formula a little bit, then it'll be fine. Why do people today still think, maybe they just, as you said, just have no idea what it's actually like. They live in America and they think, well, we need to be more socialistic, but they just don't know.
Well, they're just not taught about it. I was teaching an evening class back around 2003, 2004. Admittedly, it was a state school in Georgia, and it was not, Ivy League or anything. But I was talking about a short story by Richard Wright. And I told the students, well, you have to understand this was written during his communist phase, because for a brief period of time, in order to break into writing, he was lured in by the Communist Party. This is the African American writer Richard Wright. And so I'm, at the front of the class and I'm going on and on. And then I look over and I see about a third of the class doesn't know what I'm talking about. They've never heard of the word communism. And finally, someone raises her hand and asks me, what is communism?
Really?
And so, yeah, so that's our educational system. And when I was teaching at other places like Emory, and I tried to, teach Richard Wright again, he contributed an essay to the collection by former communists called "The God That Failed." They would look at me as if I were kind of this throwback to the McCarthy era, and automatically equate it with the Red Scare. So they'd been taught that the idea of communism, of it being something to be feared and guarded against, was a remnant from the McCarthy era. It was a figment of imagination. It was paranoia. So a lot of it has to do with our educational system. When communism is discussed, it is presented as just another system. The horrors are not talked about. It's not explained why it didn't work. But instead, our history courses focus on the failures of capitalism, but those are magnified, distorted, and so forth.
Yeah, you mentioned that book, The God That Failed. I think I read that in college or maybe graduate school. It's an interesting analogy. Is Marxism, communism, a kind of a faux religion? It appeals to people in the same way that religion does, that there's some kind of higher force, top-down force that can help us, aid us, and take care of us in a parental way. In the same way that John McWhorter and others are making the argument that wokeness is a kind of religion, that we're all born racist. It's your original sin, and you must atone for this. Even if you personally are not racist, it's in there somewhere. It's subconscious, and it leaks out, and it's in our DNA. And this gets to your debunking the 1619 Project. 1619 Project is almost like a catechism for a faux religion, that this is what we believe. And to that extent, I'm wondering what you think about this analogy that, most of your book, you're debunking the claims, the empirical claims. They're saying this happened, and you go, well, that's not actually what happened, and so on. And but what if it's not an empirical claim at all? What if it's like a religious claim? Like the resurrection, it either happened or it didn't empirically, but that's beside the point for Christians, or just pick any religious dogma. The people mostly believe it just because that's what they believe. That's their mythic truth. And so your efforts to correct the historical record may fall on deaf ears for those who are true believers. That they don't believe this stuff because of these facts that, say, Howard Zinn presents or Nicole Hanna Jones presents. That isn't the reason why they believe anyway. So they may not change their mind even if the facts change.
Well, I would make a distinction. It's critical race theory is a false religion. So I would differ with you about making the claim that it's like Christianity, and I am a Christian, but it does present a catechism, as you point out. And I think it is a religion for people who don't have religion. So something steps in, a void is filled, and they see it through social justice. They don't have a God. They don't have an authority. They don't have a point of truth. And so they try to find it solely within themselves, and they try to be virtuous. And I think there is a human need to be virtuous and to do good. A lot of these adherents, just like the adherents to Howard Zinn, believe they are doing good. And I know a lot of times it falls on deaf ears. I have this book, Debunking the 1619 Project, has only been out a couple weeks, but I can't tell you how many run-ins I've had with Howard Zinn true believers. They are believers. I've had students who have been raised in very fundamentalist families. And when I did try to introduce something controversial into the classroom, they did not want to read it because it was non-biblical. They were taught that way. I think a lot of young people these days, even people my age, who have been persuaded by these propagandists like Howard Zinn and Nicole Hanna Jones, two very skilled propagandists, are afraid to even look at the counter evidence. But as someone who taught, and even though I would get those, quizzical looks, and people would look at, students would look at me like, yeah, we know this old woman here doesn't, she's back in the 1950s. We know better than her. But occasionally you do get through, and ultimately you have to face the fact. The problem is also with the 1619 Project is that it banks upon decades of history that has been written and that has been taught in the classroom that doesn't look at the whole picture of slavery, that has presented slavery as an exclusively American practice. When I grew up, I never knew that there were Black slave owners. I didn't know that Africans first captured other Africans and sold them. I didn't know that in 1776 slavery was being practiced around the world, except in Western Europe and Antarctica. So, people just don't know that. And just like my students who, had never heard of the word communism, they don't understand slavery in its global and its historical context. And so that's what I'm trying to bring to the forefront and to present it as something that is not exclusively white, and it's not exclusively limited here to America.
I agree. I think the commitment to truth is the fundamental underlying principle we want to apply here. What really happened in the past, to the extent that we can get at it, as would be the case in any area of knowledge. There's always certain levels of uncertainty, but we have tools and instruments to help us reason our way toward a provisional truth. And again, I think that's bumping up against this impulse you mentioned that we want to be virtuous people. Everybody, I think it's in our human nature. We have a sense of right and wrong. And once we glom onto something that we think is wrong, then you feel morally outraged about it. I want to do something about this. Now, what can I do? Well, most of us can't do much of anything. I'm not a politician. I'm not a senator or congressman. I'm not the chief of police here, whatever. So, I can sign on to the 1619 Project, or I can publish an op-ed, or I could do this or that, or go down and protest against the police, and so you see these videos,
right,
like the George Floyd video. It is enraging to read to watch those videos. It's like somebody should do something, and of course most of us can't do anything. So I'm going to go down there and yell at the police because that makes me feel like I'm virtuous. And so when you point out, this is why when people go down to these marches and point out that, in fact, here's what the statistics actually show about the number of blacks that are killed by cops versus by other blacks and so on, they get outraged that you're throwing numbers at them, because it isn't about the numbers. It's about I'm upset about that thing right there, and I feel I should do something. And I think this is kind of what you're up against with the going after the 1619 Project. I see this whole thing as kind of a mythic truth, not an empirical truth. You and professional historians have pointed out all the errors that are in this document. Well, the book, and then it depends what you call the 1619 projects. They have so many different components to it now, and these teaching units they're putting together for grammar school, middle school, high school, and so on. My fear is that they're not going to course correct, because that's not what it was about in the first place. It's like it's the New York Times. They've obviously gone far left woke, and they like, we got to do something. We're the New York Times. This is what we're going to do. And then they get pushed back, and they're like, well, we don't care. We're going to do it anyway.
Well, I would have no problem with that. The New York Times can publish whatever they want. I firmly believe in the First Amendment, and they can. They've published James Baldwin and similar writers to Nicole, Hanna Jones, polemicists that have used their personal experience and written about it and have grievances and so forth. But the problem is that this is in schools and it's being taught as history, and it's not history. It's polemic, it's propaganda, and we just can't. I can't just let it sit. I have to speak out and and say something. And so I think what they're doing is they're exploiting emotion, which is what propagandists do. The video of George Floyd, yes, that's difficult to watch, but when you watch the entire thing, there's like 45 minutes of him resisting arrest, you can see the guy's on something. He's in bad shape when they meet him. They treat him professionally at first. So you kind of have an understanding, and you also understand that when the mob, comes around the police, the stress that they're under. So when you get the big picture, you can sort of understand it. And then if you're so inclined, you can read the autopsy report. You can go back through his arrest record, his imprisonments, and then you can see it a little more holistically. And that's what I'm trying to do with the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project is like that video clip of George Floyd, those moments when he's gasping for breath, but you don't see what's coming before. You only, there was a video of him. I think at one point he had gotten off of drugs and was a street preacher, and he's giving this inspirational message. So if that's all you see, then of course you're going to be very angry at the cops, and you're going to be riled up, and you're going to want to take to the streets. And that's what the 1619 Project wants young people to do. As a matter of fact, Nicole Hanna Jones has come out and said, taken credit for it when someone called the 2020 riots the 1619 riots. She said, "I'm proud of that." I mean, people died. About 30 people died. There are billions of dollars worth of damages. Black businesses were destroyed. People were hurt. But the propagandist, the revolutionary, which is what she is, the Marxist who is somehow working out her own bitterness and her own issues, is just loves the fact that she's stirring up all this violence and discord.
Yeah. If it wasn't the New York Times, would you have written this book? I live in Santa Barbara. If the Santa Barbara Independent, circulation, whatever it is, 1,200 people or something, if they did this, you and I probably wouldn't be having this conversation, right? It's the power and influence that the New York Times has, which is astonishing.
Well, in debunking the 1619 Project, I do note that there were other commemorations of the 400th anniversary of the 1619 landing. There was a one in Time Magazine, USA Today, other places. They got very little notice. But the New York Times deliberately set out to make a big splash with it. This was a long time in the making. It was an effort on the part of the newspaper to focus on race relations. So there had been an editorial meeting after the Russia collusion hoax fell apart, and they wanted to keep up circulation, so they decided they would focus on race. And here was this year coming along that Nicole Hanna Jones remembered from her high school class when she took a Black Studies class and was introduced to Lerone Bennett, the writings of him. So they said, yeah, we'll go with it. And before the ink was even dried on this magazine, it was just a special issue of the magazine. This was in classrooms, 3,500 schools across the country, students K through 12, adapted to the classroom lessons, Quizlets, discussion questions, passages, podcasts, little videos. So this was a well thought out production. So the Santa Barbara paper may have done something. You could have missed it.
That's possible. Yes, right. Well, that's the problem there. Okay, so who is Hanna Nicole Jones, and what's her background to have launched this project?
Well, Nicole Hannah Jones is, I think she's about 45 years old. She is biracial. She grew up in Iowa. She has been a reporter for the New York Times. And as far as I can tell, for her entire career as a reporter, she is focused on race. She has a master's degree in journalism from UNC Chapel Hill, I believe, and is someone who likes Marxism. She has been to Cuba. She praises the Cuban regime, likes Fidel Castro. Her
Why doesn't she move
politics
there?
are to, well, yeah, right, exactly. No, she's making too much money. I got a lot of I had a lot of open records requests, and from public universities, she was getting $25,000 a pop for an appearance. And during the pandemic, these were all online. So, like, if I were Nicole Hannah Jones right now, I'd be making $25,000.
Sorry about
So
that. We don't have that kind of money here at the Skeptic Society. Well, but of course she's donating all that money to the Black Lives Matter movement, right?
I don't know what she's doing with it. She hasn't said. But you're making that much. Doing about 2 lectures a year, or sorry, 2 lectures a month. Making other appearances, royalties, awards, and she's just making a lot of money. And of course, race hustlers do. I mean, and she is in that category. I consider her to be in line with, Al Sharpton, who profits from stirring up animus between the races, provoking violence, agitating. This is her thing. She does not understand history. She is not a historian, but what's even worse is that she refuses to acknowledge criticism or to take criticism. She doesn't understand her own limitations, her ignorance, and she only reads and uses those writers who agree with her thesis that this country is essentially a slaveocracy, that it was built on the backs of slaves, and that we are suffering the legacy today.
Yeah, I don't know about internal motives of people. It's hard to know what is in someone's heart. I guess giving them the benefit of the doubt, let's just say they feel like they're doing the right thing and not attempting to bait race, or it's a strategy maybe toward a higher goal. Let's just give that assumption there. And just look at the claims. Okay, so what is it that she, or the 1619 Project, just give us like the half dozen central core tenets that this is what we say happened, and what's the truth historically about that, starting with the 1619 slave ship that arrived.
Right. So she claims that the Africans who were on board were kidnapped by the Europeans and brought over for the express purpose of, she claims founding the country, building up the wealth. She says that slavery here was unlike anything that had ever existed in the world before, which is untrue. It was a little different. It was different from slavery among some of the indigenous tribes here in North America and in Africa, where slaves were sacrificed at the funerals of important people, sometimes buried alive with them. She claims that the wealth of this country is due to the slaves and their descendants, that slaves were seen as subhuman, that Thomas Jefferson never wanted to abolish slavery, that we declared independence largely to preserve slavery because England was, moving towards abolishing slavery, which was not true at all. That Abraham Lincoln did not care about the slaves, that the only reason that either Jefferson or Lincoln wanted colonization was to get rid of blacks, of course, whom they saw as being subhuman. So I think I got several things there, but those are sort of like the core tenets
right.
of the 1619 Project.
And the problem is you can find quotes from Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson that sound, out of context, pretty damning. There's that quote from Lincoln in which he says, my primary goal is to keep the Union together. If I could free all the slaves, I would. If I couldn't free any of the slaves, I would do that. Whatever it takes to keep the Union together. Or Thomas Jefferson saying something like, I'm not claiming that blacks are equal to whites. They're not. Everybody knows they're not. And then he launches into whatever else he says. Out of context, it sounds pretty bad.
Yeah, and that's what propagandists do. They take quotations out of context, and a favorite is Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, where it was a document that he wrote that was only intended to be distributed to a select group of people. He was an amateur scientist, and according to the most advanced scientific theories of his day, he thought he was, being advanced. I mean, think back in the 1770s, the state of scientific knowledge. He was always open, though, to being proven wrong, and he said so. And there is the case of Benjamin Banneker, the amateur scientist who was taken into a group of white scientists who were also abolitionists. He was accepted into this scientific society. He was hired to help map out, survey the new capital, Washington, D.C., on the Potomac. He was loaned a telescope so he could do, look at the sky and, publish his almanac. He was given support by so many white people, and he was encouraged to write to Jefferson when Jefferson was Secretary of State, and and Jefferson treated him with the same respect in his correspondence as he would of any white man. He he sent the almanac, I don't know how to pronounce his name, one of the philosophes, Condorcet, in France. Yeah. Right? He's saying, look, I think this guy, whatever notions we may have about the, so-called Ethiopians or Africans, as he said, I forget which term he used, but he said, look, here is evidence. We've got this great mind here. Look at this. Of course, he was killed during the revolution, so nothing ever came of that. But just think about that honor. Having him do that and assigning him to the survey team. So even with Jefferson, you can, when he's speculating about, certain physical characteristics of, blacks in notes on the state of Virginia. He's kind of doing that. He's wondering if there are glands that secrete something that makes them do so and so. I mean, it's on a biological basis, but yet he never thought of blacks as being subhuman. As someone who owned slaves, he was among the masters who was better than most. He tried as much as he could to keep families together. He hated to sell any of them off. He kept great records. And one of the things I do is I sort of compare him and his farm book, where he keeps detailed notes of slaves with first and last names, family units, what they have in terms of clothing and provisions and blankets and so forth. And another one who in the 19th century, in Louisiana, forget his name, he had an African mother and a white father, but he bought slaves, but this guy didn't care if he broke up families. His sales records were of just the first name and the age. These people to him weren't really people. They were people more to Jefferson than they were to this black slave owner. So you have all these complexities in history, and it doesn't fit into this pattern that the 1619 Project puts out there.
Yes, it's very Manichaean in its black and whiteness, when history is very subtle, and you do have to know the context in which quotes are made. We call this quote mining in skepticism, and it appears often in different kind of pseudosciences and pseudo-histories like that. When I was writing my book, Denying History on the Holocaust Deniers, I interviewed and talked to David Irving quite a bit. You mentioned David Irving in your book. Yeah, I know him pretty well. But he did this kind of thing. For example, he had this memo from Himmler after Himmler met with Hitler, and then Himmler sends this memo. It might have been to Eichmann or one of Eichmann's lieutenants, that this particular Jewish transport is not to be liquidated from Berlin. And so Irving says, you see, the Fuhrer himself said, don't liquidate the Jews. It's like, that's not what that says. It says that particular transport. And in fact, it was liquidated. So, this kind of this, and it's in German. So, and he said, well, no, in German, see, this is what it really says. There was another one with the word ausrotten, which means exterminate. And there's plenty of memos with, ausrotten the Juden, just exterminate the Jews. And Irving's like, no, ausrotten actually means to get rid of or deport the Jews. That's all they want to do, is just get rid of the Jews out of the Reich, not exterminate, Anyway, so then I showed him documents where it's like ausrotten to tuberculosis and ausrotten lice. It's like, are they talking about deporting all the lice out of the camps and sending them off to, Great Britain? Or what are we talking, ausrotten means to exterminate. It means what it says it means, But again, they play these little word games, to an obvious larger ideological agenda, which makes this pseudo-history. And that's what you're dealing with the 1619 Project. It's pseudo-history. That is the use of historical claims toward a larger ideological agenda there. And I think you quoted also Richard Evans in his book line about Hitler against Irving, just to finish that thought about David Irving. For those who can't remember this, he sued Deborah Lipstadt for calling him a Holocaust denier. Well, I called him a Holocaust denier, but I'm not Jewish, and I was kind of friendly to him, and so I think he kind of liked me, so he didn't sue me for this, but he went after her. But in England, you have to, it's reversed. She had to prove to the court that she didn't libel him. So her team hired Richard Evans, a historian of World War II, to go through with a fine-tooth comb, he and his graduate students, everything Irving ever wrote. And of course, historians make errors. That's normal. But Evans' point was that here I'll read exactly what he wrote. There's a difference between, as it were, negligence, which is random in its effects. In other words, if you're a sloppy or bad historian, the mistakes you make will be all over the place. They will not actually support any particular point of view. On the other hand, if all the mistakes are in the same direction in support of a particular thesis, then I do not think that it is mere negligence. I think that is a deliberate manipulation and deception. And I think that's what your book is doing. I should give it another proper introduction here. I've already introduced it, but Debunking the 1619 Project, and same thing with your Howard Zinn book, which I also read before I even thought of having you on the show because I really liked it, is that it's not that they're bad historians or they make mistakes. Oh, I got that date wrong or I misinterpreted that. No, it's because the errors all go in one direction. In this case, America is a slaveocracy or and what is the direction they're going toward? You said to divide America, but it's more than that. I think that is the result. It is very divisive. My sense is this is moving toward reparations, an argument for reparations. What do you think?
Yes, definitely for the 1619 project. And in June 2020, Nicole Hanna Jones had a lengthy article in the New York Times Magazine arguing for reparations, and she built on what she had said in the 1619 project. She has come out and said that in other places, and logically, that's the conclusion one would come to after reading the 1619 project. That is part of her larger goal, which is changing basically the structure of our government and moving farther and farther left to a socialistic state. So that is her goal. And Howard Zinn, of course, was the one-time Communist Party member, and he wanted a Marxist revolution. And he was doing the same things that that William Z. Foster, the Communist Party chairman, was doing in his so-called histories, except that Howard Zinn is a much more skillful writer. He was a very talented propagandist, and Nicole Hanna Jones is also she has that ability, but without pushback, it will dominate. And the thing is, you mentioned David Irving. There's no way anyone would use chapters of his books or adapt them to classroom lessons. Why would we do this with the 1619 project? It's false history. It's been demonstrated to be falsified. So, I'm trying to do, work along the same lines as Richard Evans, to take it apart, to show where it's wrong. It can't stand, just like we can't let, the history of a Holocaust denier into the classroom. We shouldn't let the 1619 project into the classroom. I have no problem with David Irving's books being published. Let adults decide for themselves. Yeah. There's no place for his books in classrooms.
Yeah, I have to agree. Remember when I first started doing that, the Free Press was about to publish his Goebbels biography, and then they got mobbed on, not online because there was no online. I think it was the mid '90s, but letter writing campaign. So they canceled it. He ended up publishing it himself. So I got the book and I read it, and it's pretty damning actually, because it includes Irving got Goebbels' diaries. They were captured after the war by the Soviets, and Goebbels had them photographed on glass plates. So Irving went to wherever the archives were, and he actually translated them. And in there, Goebbels all over the place is going, we're exterminating the Jews. We got to get rid of them. This is a hard job. And, I talked to Hitler today. We're working on it. It just goes on and on about exterminating the Jews. It's like, why did the Free Press not publish? This is really quite damning for Irving's own thesis about, his thesis has changed. Initially, it was it happened, but Hitler didn't really know about it. He wasn't really involved. It was more of a thing from Himmler and Eichmann and so on. But then he later kind of moved in more the direction that never happened at all. And so let's just, that's a sidebar because that's not what your book is about. But so let's just take that one thesis that slavery was a primary economic driver of the the American economy, and therefore American wealth has been built over the centuries on the backs of blacks, and therefore the discrepancies we see today between, say, black and white income levels or black and white wealth levels, home ownership, so on and so forth. You're aware of all those. Why is that not attributable to the Institute of Slavery?
Well, what about, the decades in between? We have, I think it was in the post-World War II period, Black income levels and all measurements of, health and welfare were rising at a faster rate than that of whites. So they weren't equal, but they were improving at a faster rate. The illegitimacy rate, which has a lot to do with poverty and crime, was much lower. Okay, now we're 50 plus years after that, and the crime rate is going up, the illegitimacy rate is going up. Well, something happened between slavery and the present, right? But those who argue for reparations just ignore that. It's not there. And if you study Black history, as I have been doing, another project I've been working on for 10 years is a biography of George Schuyler, who was this libertarian, conservative Black journalist, often called the Black H.L. Mencken. And you look back and you read the writings of these Black intellectuals and leaders in the 1920s. A completely different outlook. They were American. They believed in American values, but the communists came in and they targeted Blacks, and so this notion that one's fate is determined by what happened in history is basically a Marxist notion. It's the Marxist theory of history, right? It's not individual ability or initiative or the tragic circumstances of life, but what happens to you is based on the group you are in, and it goes according to this pattern of history. And if you look at history that way, in that very simplistic manner, which is not real history, then you can say, okay, well, because this happened in 1833, therefore. And the other thing is, I just had a piece published in the Daily Wire that talks about, reparations, and a lot of places now are doing that locally. And there's someone in Illinois who was saying, a former council member who's saying, well, we need even more, even though they're doing it locally by giving $25,000 to people whose families had been redlined. We need to do more. We need to make up for this injustice. Well, what about the Blacks who owned slaves? What if
Here in America,
there were Black slave owners who had been slaves themselves, had been manumitted by their owners, set up, being taught a profession, maybe given some livestock or whatever to set up. And as soon as they're free, one of the first things they do is they go out and they purchase slaves of their own. Now, these people were enslaved, which is the official category that Nicole Hanna Jones proposes. She says, if you identify as an African American, if you've identified that way for the last 10 years, and if you can trace your heritage back to someone who was enslaved, you deserve reparations. But what if that forebear had been both a slave and an enslaver? What if he had been like someone that George Schuyler had met in 1932 in Louisiana when he was sent by the NAACP to investigate abuse of Black levee workers, and he called on Dr. Dumas, who he said was one of a group of wealthy, and the term he used was mulattoes, someone of mixed race, whose family had been large slave owners in the 19th century, and the man was still wealthy. His wealth through his family had carried on into the Depression. So it's very complicated. How do you tease those apart? How do you make up to other people who have suffered at the hands of the U.S. government? Do you give them reparations? What about people from Eastern Europe, like me? What about our alliance with the Soviet Union? Where does it end?
Well, if anybody had a claim to reparations, it would certainly be Native Americans. I mean, the decimation of their populations, whether you think it's intentional mostly or mostly by disease, either way, and the land grab and so on, they could make a claim for trillions of dollars just in the land that was absconded by the U.S. government, something like that. Once you go down that rabbit hole, there's no checkbook big enough to really.
They were slave owners as well, the 5 civilized tribes. So.
Oh yes, I know. No,
okay,
I know.
So,
I'm aware of that too. Yeah. No, they were not noble savages. They fought. We have the archaeological record of the levels of violence between Native American tribes long before Columbus. It's a human problem,
yes.
not a European, Eurocentric, capitalist, imperialist problem. So, and also, visiting upon multiple generations, across generations, guilt for your ancestors' sins. That just doesn't wash in a kind of an enlightened judicial system. I could see a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, something like that lots of countries have done. But that's different than getting the checkbook out and starting to issue money to people. Then where does that money come from? Well, it's got to come from taxes. Well, I pay taxes, and my ancestors came here in the 1910s from Europe. So what have I got to do with slavery? Nothing. So, but I guess their argument would be, it's hard. I've been reading these books. It's hard to articulate it. It's that even if you and I are not racist at all, maybe no whites are racist anymore. It's the legacy of slavery and racism that still leads to those discrepancies between income, wealth, accumulation, and so on. It's still hard for me to see how I got a house or an education or whatever from my white ancestors, and they, going back generations, they somehow profited from slavery. But that's kind of the argument, right? It's not current racism today so much as the legacy of it.
Oh yeah, it's critical race theory. It's that's a neo-Marxist theory that's being promoted. But it's in my opinion, it's completely fallacious. It's something that has little to no basis in reality, and it's harmful. It's harmful to everyone. It's harmful to blacks and whites, all groups, and the 1619 Project is this kind of history that promotes critical race theory. It supports it. So if you believe that, in order for that sort of theory that you described to hold, you have to have this kind of history that is like the 1619 Project, that sort of skips over intervening generations, that skips over complications like Africans who sold the slaves or black slave owners. And that's the only way that it holds, but that is not reality. And the creator of the 1619 Project, Nicole Hanna Jones, is a proponent of critical race theory. So she is vehemently against legislation to keep that out of classrooms, And that legislation also at the same time targets the 1619 Project. And it should, because they're two sides of the same coin.
I want to point out that much of these arguments from critical race theory is based on this implicit association test that was developed at Harvard and has been popular for about 25 years now, that it suggests that we're all racist inside, even if you say, I'm not racist, or I harbor no negative attitudes toward minorities, and or I'm race blind or color blind or whatever. This test purports to claim, no, look, you can see right here in the scores that you are not just racist, but also misogynist and ableist and anti-fat or whatever. But the problem was this test has not survived the replication crisis in the social sciences. It first of all, it doesn't always replicate. Second of all, it's not measuring what it thinks it's measuring, which is a problem in psychometrics, called the problem of validity. There's reliability. Does it measure something consistently across time over, say, the same person taking the test? And validity, is it measuring what it says it's measuring? And so Carol Tavris, the great social psychologist, has done a lot of work on this for us, and relying on the work of other cognitive psychologists, that this associating black faces with certain words at a different rate than white faces with certain words is not measuring racism. It's measuring reaction time to words or images that you're familiar with or not so familiar with. It's a reaction time measurement, not a racism measurement. So I just want to point that out, because so much of critical race theory, even my scientist friends who don't study this, they think, well, I guess I am a racist because, look, I took the test online and it says I am, so I guess I am. And I'm one of those. I wrote about this in Scientific American, how I've read Malcolm Gladwell's book on this, and he took the test, and he's a mixed race. I guess I'm a racist too. I don't like African Americans apparently, and he's one, right? So, and I thought, oh gosh, maybe I am. So I took the test, like, oh, sure enough, I am too. Oh no, and then I started looking in the literature, going, oh, okay, so it's not really measuring that. So, so let me just return to the economic model, because you went in a slightly different direction than I thought you would. In the history of the United States, going back to colonial times, what built wealth over time. So here I'm going to read just your opening pages from Debunking Howard Zinn. I love this book, especially because almost everybody has been introduced to Howard Zinn now through that movie, Good Will Hunting. And so you talk about how he tells the Robin Williams character, you should read Howard Zinn's A People History of the United States. That book will knock you on your ass. And then you recount the bar scene, which is just such a great scene, in which Will, that's the actor. I'm sorry, who's the actor that plays Will Hunting?
Damon?
Matt Damon, yeah. So the Matt Damon character Will is a natural genius in both math and history. In a bar scene earlier on in the movie, he inserts himself into a conversation in which Clark, a Harvard graduate student, is challenging a friend who is trying to start a conversation with some young women by pretending to be a Harvard student. Clark challenges Will's friend by asking if he can provide some insight into the evolution of the market economy in the early colonies. Will, observing Clark's mini-academic disquisition on the economic modalities of the southern colonies, jumps into the conversation saying, "Of course, that's your contention. You're a first-year graduate student. You just finished some Marxist historian, Pete Garrison probably, and you're going to be convinced of that until next month when you get to James Lemon, and you're going to be talking about how the economies of Virginia and Pennsylvania were strongly entrepreneurial and capitalist back in 1740. That's going to last until sometime next year when you'll be here regurgitating Gordon Wood about, the pre-revolutionary utopia and the capital forming effects of military mobilization." Anyway, it's such a great scene. How these actors can memorize a phrase, those phrases, without stumbling is beyond me, but I'm not an actor. But this is what I'm getting at. So, to what extent does American wealth over the last, say, 250, 300 years owe to slavery versus the Northern Industrial Revolution that happened and so on? And you discussed that a little bit in your Debunking 1619 project, I think, or maybe it was the Zen book.
Well, slavery did not build the wealth of the country. True, many people got incredibly wealthy from owning slaves and exploiting slaves. Some of those, again, were Black. So I go into the stories of some of these individuals in Debunking the 1619 Project. But I draw on three well-known economic historians, Philip Magnus, Peter Koklanis, and forget his first name, but his last name is Wright. He's a British economic historian. And they draw on a report on the new school of the new history of economics. It's a neo-Marxist school that Edward Baptist belongs to. He's a Cornell history professor. And so the 1619 Project draws on Edward Baptist's book, The Half That Has Never Been Told. It's the essay that's by Matthew Desmond. And the three economic historians that I quote, all agree that, well, first of all, Peter Koklanis accuses Baptist and the other new school of historians, New Historians of Capitalism, that's the name of the school, that started around the turn of the 21st century, of being innumerate. They just can't do basic math. They overestimate the gross national product of, for cotton by tenfold. It was only responsible for about 5%. They say 50%. Matthew Desmond runs with that. Nicole Hanna Jones also cites those figures to make this claim, this outsized claim about, how much wealth was built by slaves. Of course, discounting other kinds of labor, indentures, who were the primary source of labor in Virginia and Maryland in the 17th century. Discounting everyone else. So you just look at that one, you grossly exaggerate, and then you make this specious claim that, one of the points she makes is that this country would not exist without slaves. I mean, that's ludicrous. I'm not denying that slaves were exploited. I'm not denying that they made a very small percentage of people extremely wealthy, but they held back the South. The South did not have their transportation infrastructure developed because, slaves, you could move them. It did not attract immigration and free labor and industry. So basically kept the South back. So the opposite is true of what it has been claimed in the 1619 Project. There is no society that has prospered, no slave society that has prospered. The societies that prosper are the free ones. So, everything that is in that essay that's part of the 1619 Project and that's repeated in the lead essay is wrong. It's the opposite, actually.
What percentage of white Southerners owned masses of slaves, like you see in Gone with the Wind, some big plantation, versus one slave versus no slaves?
Well, I don't know the distinction, but it's estimated that in 1830, 6% of whites owned slaves.
So 94%.
And 2% of free blacks owned slaves. So it's a very small percentage, even in the South, that owned slaves. I mean, we get this idea that, the South was, gone with the wind with plantation after rolling plantation. That was just not the case. A lot of people had one or two slaves. So the picture that is presented in the 1619 Project is of, the majority of whites owning slaves, and that was hardly the case at all.
Yeah, one of the reasons the South lost the Civil War is because the North just was so much more advanced industrially and economically. They just had a much larger GDP, just a massively larger economy to fund a war effort and just outlast them. And that's essentially what happened. Do you think slavery would have ended without the Civil War? And if so, at what point? How long would it have lasted economically?
Well, that's a good question. It was on its way out. So by 1860, slave ownership had declined among whites and blacks. And if Thomas Jefferson had, if he had had his way and if his idea had worked, it would have just died out. I mean, later in life, he advocated this plan of diffusionism. He thought that if you allowed slavery into all the territories, that the concentration would be broken up and that it would just die of its own death. It's interesting to me because one of the ideas that I've had, and I've kind of speculated on this, and it's only speculation, is that we would have had like a three-tiered racial system as they have in the Caribbean, where you have this group of elite mixed race blacks. And so there are instances that I point out in Debunking the 1619 Project where black slave owners were accepted by whites. They sometimes went to their churches, they were praised, they were accepted into the community, they collaborated with whites. Sometimes they needed to collaborate with them in order to buy more slaves. So they were accepted. It was after the agitation of the abolitionists and the threat of slave insurrections where you see that alliance kind of crack. But it would be interesting to think of what would happen, that that you would have this this society that was based on, I mean, really society was based on class. So black slave owners were accepted because they were of the upper classes. They were one of them. And I go into the Brown Fellowship Society down in Louisiana. So this was a group of elite mixed race slave owners. Then you had, and they were advocates for keeping slavery. They were on the side of the Confederacy initially until it became clear that, the Union was going to win. And then it was like, oh, well, we're all in this together, the mixed race, the others. During Reconstruction, some places, those who had been free blacks did not want to attend public school with the former slaves. So there's always been this class
Yes, right,
structure.
right. Yes. I think, if I recall, Adam Smith wrote about slavery as an economic system and was puzzled that it lasted as long as it seemed to be going. I think in the United States it was because of the cotton gin that made it more economically feasible to last a few more decades. It might have been fallen into disuse by the 1860s. Maybe with the technology like the cotton gin, it may have lasted to the 1890s or so without the Civil War doing it. On that question, there's this, it was the Civil War about slavery, ending slavery, or was it about states' rights? Or as I like to say, it was about the right of states to own slaves. That's really what it was about. What are your what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was, Lincoln didn't want to make it about slavery. I mean, he was a political leader, and the right to own slaves, was something that was being fought for. That's what Jefferson faced every time he tried to propose something, say that would make it easier to manumit slaves or something like that. He'd just get pushback. So a lot of people, wanted to maintain slavery. And so I do think that, that was the reason. I mean, of course, there you have all these, Southerners, especially, in Appalachia, and those who supported the Union weren't slave owners. They didn't want to fight this war for, these wealthy plantation owners to own slaves. I mean, slavery was keeping their wages down. But you have the vested interests, the people who do want to maintain slavery.
I'm always astonished by people today displaying the Confederate flag or cheering on Confederate leaders. Like the guy even on January 6th, one of the insurrectionists was that guy from, I think it was South Carolina, walking across the rotunda with a Confederate flag. It's like, what is this guy thinking? They lost. I mean, it's just, when did Americans start cheering for the losing side? Anyway, that's just a little sidebar. You mentioned Jefferson. Let's go back to... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's somewhat, I mean, that's the way I was taught, growing up in Rochester, New York. I lived in Georgia for 30 years, and I even see the Confederate flag on some pickup trucks up here in upstate New York. And I think it's become a symbol of regional pride and also of defiance. You want to take our flag away from us, we're going to hold on to it. How dare you take it away from us? And it's, from having lived in the South, these symbols of the Confederacy never seemed to bother anyone. The Confederate monuments, I never, Stone Mountain, take walks around it. It's there. And I think that the left has made such an issue of it that it's, like I said, they're defiant. We want to, how dare you tell us that we can't do this? That's the attitude.
That's the divisiveness, yes. Yeah, but a lot of those statues were erected not right after the Civil War, but like in the 1910s and 20s, right? They do have a kind of patina to them of the old South, the pre-antebellum South. So I could see why people would get bothered about that. But the fact that it didn't bother people before does tell us it's kind of a new social movement thing going on. Just review for us again Jefferson, and because part of the 1619 project is, Jefferson was a rapist. He raped his slaves, and that's the Sally Hemings story. But the DNA shows that, in fact, very, very unlikely he fathered her children, right? But it's not 0%.
So the DNA tests were done, and as far as could be determined, one of her children was fathered by someone in the Jefferson family. They don't know who. The family did not give permission to do further DNA testing to resolve that. The textbooks say that, he had fathered all her children. There is, that was a political rumor that was started by, I think his name was Callender, someone who did not get appointed to the position he wanted to. And it was promoted by, the opposing party. So it was a political smear, very scandalous at the time to think that, Jefferson would have gone to France and brought this young slave woman and, had her as his concubine. And So the best that can be determined, according to this group that was formed of 13 scholars, was that it was likely that the one child was fathered by Jefferson's younger brother, Randolph, I think it was, who was known to, come out to Monticello and, play the fiddle with the slaves and, got along with them. So it is unlikely that Thomas Jefferson even fathered one of her children. But in the sum total, when you look at Jefferson's life and his accomplishments, that is what is focused on, and in its attempt to destroy him personally through innuendo, to make him out to be a rapist, and to knock him off his pedestal.
Yeah, I guess because it is Thomas Jefferson, because he is such a giant in our history. Let's just take the scenario that that he did father a child with his slave, Sally Hemings. If I recall chronologically correctly, his wife had already died, right? His wife died even before he was president. All right, so let's just put a charitable spin on it, because by all accounts, he was a good guy. What if his wife dies, he's lonely, he falls in love with Sally Hemings, and they have a child together? Why is that not like a progressive thing? Like this was against the law, right? And he's breaking the law because he loves this woman, and they have a child together. There's no birth control, whatever, it just happens. So he then takes care of her and the child and so on. Why not elevate him even higher for this instead of calling him a rapist? What do we know is in his mind? How do we know what kind of relationship we don't? No one knows. So people are just throwing these things out again as a calumny, as part of a larger ideological agenda that really bothers me, because I admire him very much, Jefferson. And of course, no one's perfect, but judging people by today's standards, and often standards that were established last week of what's right and wrong, and just going back a few decades and condemning people for what they said or wrote, in the 1950s or something. It's just inappropriate, I think, much less 200 and something years ago, to assess what somebody was thinking at the time.
Yeah, I mean, Jefferson is someone that should be admired, and I admire him too. For someone of his time, the circumstances that he was born into, he is an admirable figure. And, the argument that is made about him and Sally Hemings is that, this was not an equal relationship, that he should have freed her. So I don't know. It's, to me, in the sum total of his life and of his accomplishments, it's not very important. It's a personal thing, and all human beings have their failings, their personal failings. We can go back to Martin Luther King Jr. And if we were to, do what's being done to Thomas Jefferson by, shining the spotlight on his, sex life, then, we'd have a very different image. There would be no monument made to him. There would not be, his birthday celebrated and so forth. So, what we know about Jefferson is pure speculation. It is unlikely to be true, yet it is repeatedly presented as the truth, and it's done so in the textbooks, as I found out.
Yes, there's this idea that having sex with somebody who is of a different power or control than you, again, master and slave would be the most extreme version of this. But up until really the 1980s, college professors, mostly men, would sleep with their students. This happened a lot. And now, of course, it's forbidden, and everybody knows that. At least, hopefully, everybody knows that. But again, these are standards that were just established, in the last maybe 20 years or so. in which we all have to go through the training, don't sleep with the students. I got it. Yeah, I'm not going to do that. And, but, again, just when I was in college, you could see this was happening right and left. And again, judging people, say, in the 1970s by today's standards is just inappropriate. And yet you still see some of that coming out. People, at least a couple of years ago with the Me Too movement, there were, professors from the 1970s getting accused. Well, I had a sexual relationship with this professor in 1972, and that was wrong. Well, it was wrong by today's standards, but not at the time.
Well, just to make it clear, the slave women were raped by their masters, and I consider that to be a horrible crime, and so that was common, and that's why the accusation against Jefferson is so bad. And one of the things I point out in my book is also, this is what the Irish were doing. This was being done to the Irish by their English lords, and so it's often a tool of domination. And but that's not to preclude the possibility that if Jefferson had had a relationship with her, that it would have been different. And but the point is my contention is it's not the most important thing by any means, and it hasn't been proven. And until it's proven, it should not be taught as fact in schools. And it's something that was started as a rumor by a political enemy, should not be used 200 years later today and presented as a fact.
You dedicate your book to Eugene Genovese. I leaned on his work for my chapter in the moral arc on the abolition of slavery. So I'll just read this portion to you, because what I was interested in this question is, did the slaveholders know it was immoral? I mean, did they feel the way we would feel about it? Like, I know this is wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's accepted and I can get free labor and so on. Or to what extent did they deceive themselves? So there's deception and then there's self-deception. You come to believe it. So the self-deception of slave owners and proponents of slavery is well documented by the historians Eugene Genovese and Elizabeth Fox Genovese in their book, Fatal Self-Deception, Slaveholding Paternalism in the Old South. Slavery was not perceived by most slaveholders in the 19th century to be an exploitation of humans by other humans for economic gain. Instead, slaveholders painted a portrait of slavery as a paternalistic and benign institution in which the slaves themselves were seen as not so different from all other laborers, black and white, who toiled everywhere in both free and slave states. Further, the South's Christian slavery was claimed to be superior. And here I'm quoting from the Genoveses. Decades of study had led us to the conclusion that some readers will find unpalatable. Notwithstanding self-serving rhetoric, the slaveholders did believe themselves to be defending the ramparts of Christianity, constitutional republicanism, and social order against Northern and European apostasy, secularism, and social and political radicalism. Close quote. Southern slaveholders could look around the world and see the hypocrisy with their own eyes. Quote again from the Genovese. Viewing the free states, they saw vicious negrophobia and racial discrimination in a cruelly exploited white working class. Concluding that all labor, white and black, suffered de facto slavery, or something akin to it, they proudly identified Christian slavery as the most humane, compassionate, and generous of social systems. So I like that, just kind of putting it into context of what people at the time may have been thinking.
Well, yeah, slavery was justified by all the religions, and it's, most people were living in some form of servitude. Servitude was common, and it was a difficult thing to just even to free slaves at the time. The system was just not set up for it. And when you really think about it in historical terms, slavery and servitude was the norm. What was new and radical was free labor, and there was a lot of suffering among the working classes, and the relationships even in the South between masters and slaves were complicated. And Jimmy Carter, I even heard him once on NPR, talk about being, from Georgia, and I lived in Georgia for the longest time. And he said, blacks and whites are used to being together in the South. And you see that tradition. So even though the relationship was definitely unequal, they were used to interaction. Whereas in the North, it's different. So I think, I knew Gene. I don't know if you knew him.
No, I didn't know.
Yeah. Well, when I was teaching at Emory, he of course was retired. And so for the last 5 years of his life, we would go out and have lunch a few times a year. Just a very incredible guy. And he bequeathed his Southern collection of books here to the Alexander Hamilton Institute. So when I was doing research, I could go into our basement where we have our bookshelves. There's bookshelves all over the place here in this building. And, there's the full set of Dumas Malone's biography of Thomas Jefferson. So, and his pages are kind of notated in light pencil. And so I just really felt, like his spirit was here. He was a very funny man. He was he had a great wit, very kind, a gentleman, kind of, quirky, but, I really had, a lot of affection for him and admiration. And, of course, he became a Catholic or returned to Catholicism and left behind his Marxism.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, that's right. You mentioned that in the book. That was interesting. In terms of the abolition of slavery from a moral point of view, so one of the arguments I make in the moral arc is that while you can find some religious groups like the Quakers or somebody like Wilberforce in England agitating for the abolition of slavery, their main opponents were their fellow believers, religious believers, who made the kind of arguments that the Genoveses talk about. They go through all these different sermons that preachers gave, justifying slavery and so on that you're familiar with. So how do you think about the origins of the abolition of slavery moral arguments? I pin it at secular Enlightenment arguments for the equality of people, John Locke and Rousseau and maybe not Hobbes, but Jefferson and the founding fathers and so on, they were sort of deist, secular, enlightened philosophers who make the argument that slavery is wrong. As Lincoln said, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing's wrong. And Lincoln also made a kind of I have it here, almost an algebraic or almost a geometric argument for. Let me see if I can find it here for that. In which, the interchangeable perspective. So here's how Lincoln put it. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may be right, he may of right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? You say A is white and B is black. It is color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with fairer skin than your own. You do not mean color exactly. You mean the whites are intellectually the superiors of the blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But you say it is a question of interest, and if you can make your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has a right to enslave you. And this kind of played out in the Spielberg film on Abraham Lincoln, where he makes this kind of geometric argument. And so to me, that's all a secular argument, that I have to be able to reason with you and make the case that I'm not special just because I'm me and you're not, and my skin is white and yours is not. I have to reason my way to why slavery is wrong, and I think Lincoln did that.
Yeah. Well, there is that. One of the things I mention is also of the church fathers, reforming the institution of slavery. St. Basil insisting that families be kept together, recognizing the humanity of people who were enslaved. So St. Augustine, Ibram X. Kendi gets this wrong in his book on history. He presents St. Augustine as this abolitionist. Church tradition, I don't think there's anything in the Bible that says slavery is a sin. Mistreating people is, masters need to be kind, to their servants, whether they're servants or slaves or whatever. So there's this humanitarian impulse, the recognition of humanity, and even, in slave law, when slaves were prohibited from doing certain things, they were recognized as humans. They were punished for crimes and they were recognized as humans, maybe not having the same exact rights as free people. So you do have that. Also, it's also complicated when it comes to abolition. What were the motives of some of these abolitionists? Was Lincoln motivated? Did he see blacks as completely equal? Or did he just feel that, each person should be able to retain the product of his labor, regardless of, their abilities or their talents? One of the stories I have is of Fanny Wright, who was the Scottish heiress, and she comes over with Lafayette, and she's the author says that she was his mistress, but they come and visit Jefferson, and then Fanny Wright, who's this radical feminist who has inherited this fortune, tells Jefferson about her idea of buying up all this land in Tennessee and buying slaves and, sort of rehabilitating them for several years and then gaining them their freedom. And Jefferson thinks, well, that's a great thing, one of the problems with freeing slaves was, how did they support themselves? Well, what she does is she goes and takes them to Haiti, and I talk about how the blacks who were fleeing the United States were treated in Haiti. They were put on labor camps there in a black-ruled republic. They were denied the right to vote. The author of this book that praises Fanny Wright as this radical feminist, doesn't say what happens to those 30 blacks she brings with her to Haiti. Did they starve? Right? There's a whole story there, but it was, I'm radical, and I just, have these ideas and I have these principles. And well, what happens to these people? These are actual, real people. Is it more? Are you being more of a humanitarian to set them free, and bring them to this land where they could starve? Right? Those are complicated situations, and so a lot of these abolitionists had bigger agendas. They saw emancipation as part of this kind of socialistic order with women's rights and so forth.
Yeah, I was thinking about David Irving again when I was reading your Howard Zinn book, because he made this, what we call the moral equivalency argument. So Auschwitz was bad, but hey, Dresden, the Allies bombed Dresden and killed, and he accepted Goebbels' own figure for the number killed. He basically just, Goebbels added a zero to it. I think it was 5,000, and he said it was 50,000, or it might have been 20,000 or 200,000 or whatever. But and then Irving just blindly accepted that. But not just Irving. I mean, like Daniel Goldhagen, he made his fame in a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, about the people only too willing in Poland, for example, to go along with exterminating the Jews. Okay. Then he writes another second book on genocide, and he basically says Harry Truman is a war criminal for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's like, hang on. This is the same kind of David Irving moral equivalency argument. But Daniel Goldhagen is he's not a Holocaust denier, to say the least. So what's going on here? And I think what I was thinking about this with your Howard Zinn book, and not just Howard Zinn, but like Noam Chomsky does this all the time. Yes, these dictators, these third world dictators, these South American dictators are bad, but look what the CIA did, or look what the U.S. government did here. But the reason we bombed Dresden and mass carpet bombing was to end the war, to stop the killing. The goal wasn't to exterminate a people. The goal of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not to exterminate the Japanese. It was to stop the war, get them to surrender, which they finally did. And so here I would say, again, with both your books, yes, the things we did, there are plenty of blemishes on the American record, for sure, not to mention the Native Americans and all that. But to the larger goal, what we are the ones in England, that abolished slavery. And you list all the countries that didn't abolish slavery until like well into the 20th century, late 20th century. And that, it was our system of government set up in the long run. This was going to lead to more freedom and prosperity for more people in more places. And it's that system that's set up we should not condemn, along with the blemishes on our record.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, that's sort of the abuse of history. And like you said, this false moral equivalency. And I think it resonates often with young people. And that's why it's so dangerous. And Howard Zinn does that throughout. And I think those who justify, the rioting last year also do that to an extent. They say, we have police killing Black men like George Floyd all the time, and it's justified. And so, but what I would say is, look at the human beings, look at who is being hurt, and also look at the motivations. You have to do that, like you said. If it's wartime, it's to end war. It's not gassing Jews in concentration camps. There's no justification for that at all.
Yes, even our putting Japanese Americans into prison camps is as bad as that is, particularly in perspective. The goal was not to exterminate them, right? So again,
exactly.
The context is very different. Well, Mary, we've been going over an hour and a half.